Shaquille O'Neal entered a high-end car dealership in downtown Los Angeles, dressed simply in casual attire, making it hard to tell he was a basketball legend. Inside the dealership, crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling and marble floors gleamed, reflecting the elegance of the luxury vehicles displayed like works of art. Shaq moved slowly, his eyes landing on a vintage car in a corner, his calm demeanor suggesting he preferred to remain unnoticed. However, before he could approach the car, a sharp voice from behind him broke the silence. "Are you sure you can afford to be here?" The question came from the manager, who eyed Shaq with an air of judgment, as though one look could determine a person's worth. What happened next would stun everyone in the dealership and deliver a valuable lesson. But before continuing the story, we ask you to let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy these types of stories, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more inspirational videos. The sun had just risen over Los Angeles, casting golden rays over the city's skyline. The crisp morning air was filled with the sounds of a city awakening. Shaquille O'Neal strolled down a familiar street, dressed simply in a way that anyone could overlook his status as a basketball icon. He was a legend both on the court and in the hearts of the public. Walking slowly, his face calm but with a glint of focus in his eyes, Shaq paused in front of a small, charming coffee shop with a weathered sign. The glass door chimed as he entered, filling the air with the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee. "Shaq, my hero." Mike, the barista in his signature green apron, called out with a grin, his voice tinged with humor. Shaq chuckled, leaning down to give Mike a handshake, their exchange warm and familiar. "Good morning, Mike." "The usual, please. Latte with a little extra foam," Shaq said. "Sure thing, big guy. But what's on your mind today?" "You planning to slam dunk at the local court again?" Mike asked, preparing the drink. Shaq shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. "No, today's special," he said, his voice becoming thoughtful. "I'm looking for a vintage car, not just to collect, but to symbolize something bigger. A project I'm working on, something that will inspire people and remind them of what we can achieve together: community, hope, and giving back." Mike smiled knowingly as he slid the coffee towards Shaq. "You always think bigger than anyone I know, Shaq." "I hope you find exactly what you're looking for." Shaq nodded, accepting the cup, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He paused for a moment, sipping the warm latte, taking in the hustle of the city, cars speeding by, bicycle bells ringing, and the laughter of young people. It was a symphony of life playing around him. Inside, Shaq's resolve grew stronger. Today, his quest to find the perfect car would begin, and he believed that it wouldn't just be a personal journey, but one that could touch countless lives. With that thought in mind, he stepped forward, merging into the crowd, a simple man with grand dreams in his heart. After finishing his coffee, Shaq tossed the empty cup into a nearby trash can. Standing for a moment, he looked up at the towering glass building before him. Morrison's Auto Emporium, a luxury car dealership known for housing some of the world's rarest and most expensive vehicles. The gleaming metallic sign reflected the morning sunlight, exuding an air of glamour designed to impress anyone who looked at it. Shaq smiled, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy glass doors. Inside, luxury reigned. The marble floors, modern art on the walls, and new leather scents blended with high-end cologne, all reinforcing the sense of exclusivity. Several sharply dressed salespeople engaged in quiet conversations with equally well-dressed clients, their expressions a mix of smugness and self-importance, as if their mere presence proved their elevated social standing. Shaq, wearing a simple hoodie and jeans, stood out like a sore thumb despite his tall, muscular frame. His casual attire drew attention, and people glanced at him, quickly looking away, whispering among themselves. In the center of the showroom, Richard Morrison, the dealership's owner, was deep in conversation with a female client, his hand resting lightly on a brand new sports car. Richard, a middle-aged man with perfectly styled hair and a suit tailored to perfection, exuded a refined, calculated air. His smile was polite, but his sharp eyes were constantly evaluating the worth of everything and everyone around him. When Richard's gaze landed on Shaq, his smile faltered briefly, replaced by a glimmer of suspicion. Without a word, he subtly signaled to a nearby employee, instructing them to deal with the unexpected visitor. Shaq seemed oblivious to the chill in the air as he strolled leisurely past the rows of luxury cars, each one a masterpiece, from sleek modern sports cars to meticulously restored vintage classics. But it was a black vintage car in the far corner that caught his eye. The car, a 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, sat atop a rotating platform. Its lines were exquisite, every detail carefully crafted, from the door frames to the iconic emblem. The glossy paint reflected light, and Shaq could almost feel the echoes of history within it. This was the car he had been searching for, not just a vehicle, but a symbol. "Need help with something, buddy?" A voice interrupted Shaq's thoughts. It belonged to Josh, a young salesman with a bored expression. Josh quickly assessed Shaq, lingering on his hoodie and worn sneakers. "That car isn't something just anyone can afford," Josh added. Shaq smiled faintly, his tone calm. "I was just curious." "What model is it?" Josh sighed, clearly uninterested. "It's a 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, one of the rarest. I'll get someone to explain it to you." Without waiting for a response, Josh turned and walked away, leaving Shaq standing alone. Shaq said nothing, continuing to admire the car, but he couldn't ignore the whispers nearby. "What's he doing here? Probably just wants pictures to show off. He's in the wrong place if he thinks he can buy anything here." The words were soft but cutting, and although Shaq pretended not to hear them, his gaze darkened for a moment. In the distance, Richard finished his conversation and started toward Shaq, his eyes filled with both curiosity and suspicion. With a confident stride, Richard approached, his presence heavy with silent judgment. Shaq remained still, his eyes locked on the vintage car, unaware that this encounter would soon trigger a series of events full of tension and surprising twists. Shaq gently reached out, letting his fingers glide over the car's cool, glossy surface. It wasn't just a car. It was a masterpiece, every curve and detail of the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost radiating timeless elegance. His admiration was palpable, but the quiet moment was soon interrupted by the sound of polished leather shoes tapping against the marble floor. Richard Morrison, dressed in a perfectly fitted black suit, approached Shaq. He stopped a few feet away, scanning Shaq from head to toe as though judging him unworthy of being in such an upscale setting. Clearing his throat softly, Richard made his presence known. Shaq turned to face him, his expression calm. "Good morning," Shaq greeted, his voice deep and polite. Richard smirked faintly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning. How may I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but with an undertone of mockery. "I'm interested in this car," Shaq replied calmly. "I'd like to know more about it." Richard raised an eyebrow, eyeing Shaq's modest attire before continuing. "This car," Richard began slowly, almost as if telling a story, "is one of the rarest vintage models in the world. Only a few are fortunate enough to even see it, and even fewer have the means to own it." Shaq nodded, unaffected. "That's fascinating. Can I get more details on its price and other information?" Richard crossed his arms, his demeanor cooling. "Of course, but let me remind you, this isn't a car for just anyone. We deal only with clients who truly understand its value, and naturally, those with the financial means to acquire it." The air thickened with tension. Shaq met Richard's gaze, unruffled. "Thank you, I understand," Shaq responded. Richard, silent for a moment, turned to Josh, a salesperson standing nearby, who looked uncomfortable at being summoned. "Josh, perhaps you could explain the details of this vehicle to our guest," Richard said, his tone a command. Josh sighed, barely concealing his reluctance. "This car," Josh began briskly, "is the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. It has a special edition, premium leather interior, and the original engine." He shrugged nonchalantly, everything a high-end collector would expect. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Original engine? Does it still run well?" Josh let out a dry laugh. "Run well? I wouldn't think of it as a car to drive around. It's more of a collector's item for those who understand." Shaq smiled faintly. What about the price? Josh hesitated before shaking his head. You'll have to talk to the manager for specifics. This isn't the kind of car just anyone can buy. Let me get Richard for you. Josh turned, but instead of seeking Richard, he joined a group of employees near the reception desk. Low whispers quickly followed, clearly meant to be overheard. Who does he think he is? Look at his clothes. No way he can afford that car. Probably just here to take pictures and brag. Shaq heard every word, but he remained unfazed, his focus still on the car, unaffected by the growing whispers and giggles that felt like daggers to his dignity. Meanwhile, Richard observed the scene from afar, his calculating gaze taking everything in. He made no attempt to stop the staff's behavior, letting a self-satisfied smile spread across his face, clearly pleased by the judgment they had passed. Shaq stood his ground, unbothered by the alienating atmosphere. Still, a flicker of disappointment flashed in his eyes. He was no stranger to people like Richard and Josh, who judged others solely based on appearances, but that wouldn't stop him from pursuing what he came for. Shaq remained still next to the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, his eyes scanning the car's every detail, imagining the history it carried. His peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of polished leather shoes echoing on the marble floor. The footsteps were firm and deliberate, and as Richard approached, he stopped a few paces away, arms crossed. His scrutinizing gaze swept over Shaq once again, this time with a more dismissive and evaluative look. Richard, in his tailored black suit and gold watch, exuded an air of authority, contrasting with Shaq's more relaxed appearance. "Hello," Richard began, his voice measured and slow, as though each word was deliberately crafted to emphasize his superiority. "I see you're interested in this car." Shaq, unfazed, offered a polite nod and a courteous smile. "That's right. I've heard this is one of the rarest vintage models. I'm very intrigued by it." Richard's smile was thin, his detachment evident. "You're correct. This is the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, a true masterpiece. Very few people even get the chance to see it, let alone own it." He placed emphasis on the word own, his eyes narrowing as they scanned Shaq from head to toe. "We usually only deal with clients who truly understand its value," Richard added. Shaq, undeterred by the condescension, nodded. "I understand. That's why I want to learn more about it and seriously consider purchasing it." Richard's slight smile flickered as Shaq's calm, assured response caught him off guard. Recovering, Richard's smile became faintly mocking. "I'm glad to hear you're serious," Richard said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But, as you know, this car isn't for just anyone. We have certain criteria for potential buyers. It's not just about money. It's about suitability." Shaq's expression remained steady. "What are your criteria?" he asked, his voice calm yet firm. Richard's smirk deepened, clearly eager to pass judgment. "Criteria. It includes strong financial capability, appreciation for the car's true value, and of course, the right style. This car is a symbol of status, not just a vehicle. We need to ensure that whoever owns it is truly deserving." Despite Richard's veiled disdain, Shaq remained unflinching. "I understand the value of this car very well, Mr. Morrison. I'm not here to waste anyone's time. I'm serious about buying it." For a moment, Richard seemed taken aback, but instead of backing down, he stepped closer to Shaq, his eyes openly challenging. "Are you serious?" Richard asked slowly, as if testing Shaq's resolve. "Fine, but I should warn you, this car is worth more than a Beverly Hills mansion. It's not something for idle dreams or casual admiration." Shaq's gaze remained steady, unwavering under Richard's provocation. "As I said, I'm not here to dream. I want this car." Richard paused, clearly unsettled, searching Shaq's face for any sign of hesitation. All he saw was a man standing firmly. This realization seemed to rattle Richard, who was not accustomed to being challenged. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice sharp. "Very well," he said. "I'll provide you with more details, but I hope you understand we don't waste time on those who aren't qualified." Shaq didn't respond immediately. Instead, he met Richard's gaze, his eyes full of calm strength. "I always respect other people's time, Mr. Morrison," Shaq replied, his voice deep and measured. "I hope you'll do the same for me." For a moment, Richard hesitated. Instead of answering, he turned and signaled for Josh to bring additional details. A faint smile tugged at his lips, as though the real challenge had only just begun. Shaq remained where he was, his gaze returning to the Rolls-Royce. The tension in the air was palpable, but he was undeterred. He knew he stood in a place where respect was hard-earned, but that wouldn't stop him from achieving his goal. Richard returned with a thin file on the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. His demeanor was unchanged, his smile conveying a mix of smugness and concealed contempt. He placed the file on a nearby glass table and looked at Shaq with a challenge in his eyes. "You know," Richard began, dragging out his words as if to make a point, "this car isn't just a means of transportation. It's a symbol of success, of class. Very few people get the chance to own one, and even fewer truly understand what it represents." Shaq, maintaining his calm demeanor, stepped closer to the table, glancing at the file but not touching it. "I understand your point," he said, his voice deep but steady. "I know the value of a classic car like this. I'm not here to dream. I'm here to buy." Richard let out a slight chuckle, though it was insincere. "You're serious?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "Let me make this clear. This car is worth as much as a luxury estate in Beverly Hills. It's not something just anyone can consider buying. It takes more than curiosity and a bit of courage to walk into a dealership." Shaq met Richard's gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I understand that very well," he replied, his tone still composed. "But I don't believe a person's worth is measured by what they wear or how they enter a room." Richard was silent for a moment, his displeasure clear in his eyes. He stepped closer to Shaq, lowering his voice to add an intimidating edge. "I've met a lot of people like you," he said, almost in a whisper. "They walk in here with big hopes, dreaming they can touch something they'll never reach. I hate to break it to them, but that dream usually ends when they hear the real price." Shaq narrowed his eyes slightly and tilted his head, as if to confirm what he just heard. "A dream?" he repeated, his voice low but carrying weight. "You think I'm here to dream?" Richard folded his arms, his smirk growing dismissive. "I don't think I know. Those who can truly afford it don't need to talk so much. They let their actions speak for them. Honestly, you don't strike me as that kind of person." Shaq remained silent for a moment, staring at Richard. His expression wasn't one of anger, but quiet disappointment. He was used to being judged by how he looked, though it never stopped hurting. After a soft sigh, he spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not sure what kind of people you've met before, but one thing I know for sure is that judging someone based on their appearance isn't accurate. It usually reflects more on the person doing the judging than the one being judged." His words struck Richard unexpectedly, causing him to freeze briefly, but he quickly regained his composure, masking his discomfort with a smirk. "Maybe you're right," Richard replied, though his sarcasm remained. "But I've worked here long enough to know who's a serious buyer and who's just here to dream about things they can never have." Shaq gave a slight shrug, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Maybe so, but the world I belong to isn't defined by cars or dealerships. It's about how I treat others and how they treat me." Richard seemed caught off guard for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Silence enveloped them, broken only by distant murmurs of staff and customers. But despite the stillness, the tension was palpable. Shaq stood tall and unwavering, while Richard, though masking his discomfort, felt an undeniable strength emanating from Shaq. Strength not from wealth or status, but from character. Richard let out a dismissive laugh, stepping back. "I'll leave you to admire the car," he said, though his tone still held skepticism. "If you need anything else, feel free to ask." Shaq didn't respond. He simply nodded, turning back to the car with a faint trace of disappointment. He hadn't come here to argue, nor to prove a point. He was seeking something meaningful, but with every word Richard spoke, it became clearer that arrogance and prejudice ran deep in this world. Still, Shaq refused to let it dishearten him. In the end, action spoke louder than words. Shaq continued examining the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, tracing its elegant curves, though his thoughts were consumed by Richard's harsh words. The air seemed to grow heavier, and soon Richard returned, his demeanor now more forceful. His footsteps were more deliberate, and when he stopped a few paces away, arms crossed, the air grew tense. Richard finally spoke, his voice colder, his words laced with challenge. "I think it's time we get to the point," he began. "This place isn't for people to simply admire or fantasize about things they can't afford." Shaq looked up, steady as ever, with a faint flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He said nothing but met Richard's gaze, waiting for him to continue. Richard stepped closer, nearly face to face with Shaq, his voice lowering with contempt. "My time and my team's time are valuable. I don't appreciate it being wasted by someone who has no real intention of buying." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just a touch. "You think I'm wasting your time?" he asked, his tone calm but heavy with meaning. Richard shrugged, a smirk curling on his lips. "It's not just a thought, it's a fact," he retorted sharply. "This dealership is for those who can afford it, and frankly, given your appearance and demeanor, I don't think you understand the true value of what's here." Richard's words echoed through the now quiet showroom, drawing the attention of staff and customers. The atmosphere thickened, charged with tension, as Richard's voice grew louder. "You're wasting my time, my team's time, and your own," he declared, stepping even closer. "If you can't afford it, you should leave." Shaq remained rooted in place, unyielding to Richard's aggression. He took a slow, deep breath, calming the storm within him. When he spoke, his voice was clear and composed. "Respect, Mr. Morrison," he said, emphasizing each word, "is something everyone can afford if they choose to." Richard faltered, his irritation growing. "Respect?" he repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "You think you can talk about respect when you walk in here without knowing your place?" Shaq met his gaze, unwavering. "Respect isn't something either of us can dictate," he replied, his tone steady. "It's a basic courtesy we should extend to each other, no matter who they are, what they wear, or where they come from. It costs nothing, but sometimes it's harder to find than this car." Shaq's words landed like a punch, leaving Richard momentarily speechless. The silence between them grew even heavier, but Richard wasn't one to back down. He stepped even closer, his voice now low and seething with contempt. "You honestly think I don't know what kind of person you are?" he growled. "People like you come in here, look around, dream big, and leave empty-handed. You don't belong here, and I'm not going to waste another second on you." Shaq didn't flinch, but his posture shifted. He stood taller, his broad shoulders commanding attention. His presence was enough to silence the room, even without raising his voice. When he spoke, his tone remained steady, devoid of anger, but filled with quiet authority. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Morrison. I don't belong here, not because I can't afford it, but because this place lacks the most basic thing, respect for people." Richard instinctively stepped back, a mixture of anger and embarrassment flooding his face. Before he could respond, Shaq continued, his voice calm but resolute. "I didn't come here looking for respect from you. I came here because I thought this place, like this car, might represent something greater. But now I see that true luxury isn't found in cars or grand walls. It's found in how we treat each other." Shaq's words seemed to freeze the room, leaving Richard rooted in place, his face a storm of fury and defeat. The tension in the air was thick, but Shaq didn't linger. He turned and walked toward the exit, his steps deliberate and measured. The silence behind him was deafening, broken only by the hushed admiration of a few younger staff members. The confrontation was over, but the lesson Shaq imparted lingered long after he left. As he neared the large glass doors, the sunlight framed his silhouette, solid and unyielding. But the stillness didn't last. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed behind him, signaling Richard's approach. His eyes bloodshot and face contorted with anger, Richard stormed toward Shaq, unable to contain his fury. "Who do you think you are?" Richard growled, his voice sharp and cutting. "You walk in here preaching like you're better than me. Do you even know who you're dealing with?" Shaq paused but didn't immediately turn around. He stood still, taking a deep breath, steadying himself. Richard closed the distance, his voice growing louder, dripping with derision. "You don't deserve to be here," he spat. "Don't think your little speech changes anything. People like you—" Richard's tirade was abruptly cut short by his own unrestrained anger. His fists clenched, and in a flash, he lunged at Shaq, swinging at him as if trying to physically silence his words. But before Richard's fist could land, Shaq spun around with surprising speed. He raised his hand and caught the punch mid-air, stopping it with nothing but his palm. The soft thud of contact echoed, not as a sound of violence, but of calm authority. The entire room froze, eyes wide with shock. Richard stood there, his fist trapped in Shaq's hand, his face a mixture of anger, shock, and embarrassment. Shaq, towering over him, radiated calm, his expression one of disappointment rather than fury. "Your anger," Shaq said quietly, his voice steady, "isn't because of me. Maybe it's time you took a hard look at yourself." Richard stood frozen, his fist still held tightly in Shaq's hand, no longer radiating the strength he had moments ago. Instead, he wore an expression of disbelief, not fearing retaliation, but shocked that the man he had belittled handled the situation with such poise and control. Shaq released his grip smoothly, stepping back to create space while maintaining his unwavering stance. The tension in the dealership grew thick, and employees who had been quietly observing now distanced themselves further, unwilling to intervene. A few customers looked on, their curiosity barely concealed by judgmental stares directed at Richard. Breaking the silence, Shaq's calm voice addressed Richard once more, saying, "Mr. Morrison, respect doesn't stem from power or position. It's about how we treat others. You may own every car here, but without respect, they are just inanimate objects." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Shaq's statement had struck him silent, the truth of it making him reflect inwardly, his rage giving way to shame. Standing tall, Shaq's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of employees, customers, and finally Richard. He wasn't seeking approval. He simply wanted to impart a lesson about dignity and respect. "We don't have to be the same to show respect," Shaq added, before turning his back to walk toward the exit. "I hope you remember that." No one attempted to stop him as the glass doors swung open, and he stepped into the bright Los Angeles morning, leaving behind a dealership filled with tension and a manager facing the consequences of his actions. Inside, the atmosphere remained thick with discomfort. Richard, once full of confidence, now looked defeated. He tried to regain his composure, but whispers began to spread through the room, each one cutting deeper into his remaining pride. Meanwhile, a young customer named Ethan, a college student and car enthusiast who had witnessed the entire scene, began recording the confrontation on his phone. After Shaq left, Ethan uploaded the video to social media with a caption that read, "When a legend teaches an arrogant man a lesson in respect." Within hours, the video went viral across platforms like Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, with millions of views and widespread reactions. Many expressed outrage at Richard and the dealership, condemning the way Shaq had been treated. Others praised Shaq for his calm and dignified handling of the situation. His words about respect became a widely quoted mantra, and the video sparked discussions about prejudice and human values. Even major news outlets joined in, with articles like one from the New York Times emphasizing Shaq's reminder that respect should be a universal right, not something tied to status. As Shaq became a symbol of humility and dignity, the dealership faced a severe backlash. Morrison's Auto Emporium's social media pages were flooded with negative comments. Some loyal customers vowed never to return, and contracts for high-value car purchases were abruptly canceled. Former partners also distanced themselves from the dealership, including the Los Angeles Classic Car Association, which made a public statement denouncing the incident. Under intense pressure, the parent company of Morrison's Auto Emporium issued a public apology, expressing regret for the way Shaquille O'Neal was treated. They promised to review their practices to ensure better customer service moving forward. However, the apology was not well received. Many saw it as an attempt to protect the dealership's reputation rather than a genuine expression of remorse. Richard's attempt at an apology in a video posted on the dealership's Facebook page only further fueled public resentment. His words seemed insincere, with many critics accusing him of trying to salvage his reputation. The comments below the video were filled with outrage, with people calling for real actions to prove his sincerity. Meanwhile, former and current employees of Morrison's Auto Emporium, who had stayed silent under Richard's management, began to speak out, revealing that Richard's behavior was not an isolated incident. This only deepened the public's negative perception of both Richard and the dealership. An anonymous employee shared with the Los Angeles Times that Mr. Morrison consistently treated both staff and customers with contempt unless they appeared wealthy or influential. He would often make derogatory remarks and dismiss those he considered unworthy of being in the dealership. Another former employee spoke on LinkedIn, revealing how Mr. Richard would mistreat customers he didn't deem important. While these actions were common, no one dared to speak out, fearing for their jobs. They expressed relief that the truth was finally being exposed. These revelations only fueled the growing public anger, as articles, interviews, and comments highlighted how Richard's behavior was not just an isolated incident but part of a toxic culture that had long plagued the dealership. Under mounting criticism and financial losses, Morrison's Auto Emporium had no choice but to temporarily shut down for restructuring. Signs were removed, former employees were let go, and Richard was indefinitely suspended, facing the possibility of being permanently dismissed. The dealership's once pristine reputation was now forever linked to arrogance and discrimination. This tarnished image spread beyond Los Angeles to other cities with Morrison's branches, causing people to distance themselves from the brand. Richard's actions didn't just ruin his own career, they also dragged down the dealership he once held dear. Meanwhile, the message Shaq imparted about respect continued to resonate with people, setting a standard that businesses everywhere, regardless of industry or status, now sought to uphold. After the incident at Morrison's Auto Emporium, Shaq avoided the drama that followed, as he wasn't interested in unnecessary attention. For him, the important part of the story was the lesson about respect, a reminder of how simple acts of kindness could change the way people treat one another. A few days later, Shaq went to a smaller, humble dealership on the outskirts of Los Angeles, Sam's Classic Auto. Unlike Morrison's, it wasn't known for its grand decor or flashy facade. Instead, it had a rustic charm, with classic cars neatly displayed under the sun. Sam, the owner, warmly greeted Shaq, undaunted by his height or fame, treating him simply as a customer looking for something meaningful. Shaq mentioned wanting a car with a story, and Sam eagerly showed him around, sharing the history behind each vehicle. There was no pressure, just genuine passion. When they reached a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado, Sam explained that it had once belonged to a famous jazz musician who drove it across the country, performing in small clubs and inspiring many. Shaq was captivated by the car, feeling it was exactly what he was looking for. The buying process at Sam's was nothing like his experience at Morrison's. It was respectful and professional, with no arrogance. After finalizing the paperwork, Shaq took a photo with Sam and his team, later posting it on social media with the message, "True luxury is being treated with respect. Thank you, Sam and your team, for reminding me of that." The post quickly went viral, and it wasn't just Shaq's fame that captured attention. It was the sincerity of the message. People praised both Shaq's humility and Sam's dealership for its respect and honesty. Sam's Classic Auto, previously unknown, suddenly became a symbol of integrity, drawing customers from far and wide, not just for cars, but for the atmosphere of sincerity. Shaq, not stopping there, decided to use the Cadillac for a charitable project. He had it restored and auctioned off, with all proceeds going to educational and community organizations focused on promoting awareness and equality. At the auction, Shaq addressed the attendees, explaining that the car symbolized the way negative moments could be turned into opportunities for change. He emphasized that respect is priceless, yet it's the most valuable thing one can give. His words resonated deeply with the crowd, sparking a strong applause. The Cadillac sold for an extraordinary $5 million, and the funds were used to support causes that promote education and equality. Shaq's actions went beyond the auction. His story sparked a global movement, emphasizing respect in business and everyday life. The hashtags #RespectThisLuxury and #LearnFromSha became spaces where people shared their personal experiences of discrimination, reinforcing the universal importance of respect. Major global brands, including Rolls-Royce and Gucci, also embraced this message, emphasizing inclusivity and equality in their marketing campaigns. UNICEF and Amnesty International used Shaq's story to highlight human rights causes. As the movement grew, industries began making tangible changes. The automotive industry implemented better customer service training, while the hospitality sector introduced diversity programs. Shaq, however, didn't seek attention for his actions, continuing his charity work and using his influence to spread the message of respect. His image transformed into one not just of athletic prowess, but also of humility and compassion. One of his quotes, "Respect has no price, but when you give it, you create immeasurable value," was displayed on posters, T-shirts, and billboards around the world. What began as a simple incident at a car dealership became a global movement, reminding everyone that respect is a value everyone can afford. As the story spread, it became clear that one person's actions can make a profound difference in how we treat one another. As Shaq prepared for the auction of his Cadillac, it wasn't just about selling a car. It was about sending a message that acts of kindness and respect can change the world. The auction became an unforgettable event, with every penny raised going to charities supporting education and inclusion. At the event, Shaq's words, "Respect doesn't cost a dime, yet it's the most valuable thing we can give to one another," inspired the crowd. The Cadillac sold for $5 million, and the funds were directed to causes close to Shaq's heart. Through his actions, Shaq demonstrated that even in moments of adversity, there's an opportunity to create positive change. The story of the Cadillac became a symbol of the power of respect, transcending the realm of luxury cars to touch lives worldwide. The ripple effect of Shaq's message continued to inspire individuals and organizations, encouraging everyone to treat one another with the respect they deserve. Shaq's journey turned a negative incident into a catalyst for global transformation.